Sometimes we must choose between our heart and our crown, between love and duty. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one willing to risk everything for a second chance. Queen Ragna entered the great hall with one purpose: to confront the giant blacksmith who threatened her kingdom. Ulfrik had grown too powerful, too wealthy, too dangerous to ignore. Her ultimatum was simple: wed me or lose everything you own. But this wasn't just politics. Years ago, before she wore a crown and he commanded armies, they were simply two young people by a river who made promises they couldn't keep. Now, with rebellion brewing and enemies closing in, their past collides with their present. Will love save a kingdom, or will it destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Ironhold stretched before Queen Ragna like a battlefield she had walked onto countless times before, yet never with stakes quite this high. Massive oak beams soared overhead, carved with the histories of her ancestors, kings and queens who had ruled with iron fists and steady hearts. The morning light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor where her boots echoed with each deliberate step. She had chosen this moment carefully. The harvest feast was 3 days past, and most of the nobles had returned to their holdings, leaving only the essential court and, more importantly, the common folk who had stayed to conduct their winter business. These were Ulfrik's people now, though they might not yet realize it. They came to him for metalwork, for advice, for the kind of steady leadership that her own court had failed to provide in recent months. Ragna's fingers traced the cold iron of her crown, a simple circlet forged by her grandfather's own hands, designed not for beauty but for purpose. The weight of it pressed against her temples, a constant reminder of the choices that had led her to this moment. At 32, she had ruled for 8 years since her father's death, and in that time she had learned that crown and heart rarely aligned. The queen's wolf fur cloak, a gift from the northern clans who still honored the old alliances, swept behind her as she moved. She had worn it deliberately today, knowing how it would catch the light, how it would remind everyone present of the power she still commanded beyond these walls. But power, she had discovered, was like water in cupped hands. The tighter you gripped, the faster it slipped away. Ulfrik stood near the great forge that dominated the hall's eastern wall, his massive frame bent over an anvil where sparks flew like tiny stars. Even from across the vast space, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the careful precision of his hammer strikes, the way younger men gathered around him to watch and learn. He had always moved with that same quiet confidence, even as a boy. The last time she had seen him this close was at her coronation 8 years ago. He had knelt with the other subjects, his dark hair falling across his face as he pledged his loyalty to the crown. She remembered fighting the urge to reach out and touch that familiar head, to whisper words that had nothing to do with kingdoms or duty. Instead, she had accepted his oath with the same distant grace she showed all her subjects, pretending her heart hadn't recognized the boy who had once promised to build her a house by the river. Now, watching him work, she could see how much he had changed. The lanky youth had filled out into a man who commanded respect without demanding it. His workshop had grown from a single forge to an operation that employed half the village. His advice was sought on matters far beyond metalwork, disputes between neighbors, trading concerns, even matters of local justice that should have come before her own magistrates. This was the problem. Not that Ulfrik was ambitious, ambition she could handle. The problem was that he was good at what he did, and people had begun to look to him instead of to her crown. In a kingdom where loyalty was everything, divided attention was the first step toward divided loyalties. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 8 years trying to be the queen her people needed, making the hard choices, sacrificing her personal desires for the greater good. And now, the very thing she had given up, the love she had walked away from to accept her crown, had grown into the greatest threat her kingdom faced. 3 of her earls had already approached her privately about the Ulfrik situation. Earl Magnus, whose own holdings bordered Ulfrik's expanding influence, had been the most direct. "Your Majesty, the man commands more loyalty in his workshop than some of us do in our own halls. This cannot continue." She had listened to their concerns with the patience that 8 years of rulership had taught her, but she knew their real fear. They weren't worried about the kingdom, they were worried about their own positions. Ulfrik's rise threatened the careful balance of power that kept the nobility in their comfortable stations. But there were other whispers too, ones that cut deeper. Her own advisors had begun to question her decision to remain unmarried. "A queen needs an heir," they reminded her with increasing frequency. "The kingdom needs stability." What they didn't say, but what she heard clearly, was that an unmarried queen approaching her middle years was a liability they could no longer afford. The truth was more complex than any of them knew. She had received offers. Oh, how she had received offers. Kings from distant lands, neighboring jarls with strategic holdings, even her own earls with unmarried sons. Each proposal came with its own political advantages, its own promise of alliance and strength. She had considered them all with the careful attention of a ruler who understood that marriage was never about love. It was about survival. Yet none of them had moved her to action. None of them had stirred anything deeper than political calculation. And now, facing the possibility of civil unrest, watching her own people turn to another for leadership, she finally understood why. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Her personal guard, Bjorn, moved with the careful alertness of a man who had kept her alive through 3 assassination attempts and countless political storms. His presence was both comfort and reminder. She was never truly alone, but she was also never truly free. "Your Majesty," he murmured, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Are you certain about this course?" She turned to study his weathered face, seeing the concern there that he would never voice more directly. Bjorn had been her father's man before he was hers, and he remembered the girl who had once slipped away from her tutors to meet a blacksmith's apprentice by the river. More than that, he understood the cost of the choices she had made since. "I am certain that our current course leads to ruin," she replied quietly. "Sometimes, old friend, we must risk everything to save anything." The great hall was filling now as word of the Queen's presence spread. Merchants paused their negotiations, craftsmen set aside their tools, and children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts to catch a glimpse of their ruler. She could feel their curiosity. Their speculation about why Queen Ragna had come personally to conduct business that could have been handled by any number of royal representatives. Ulfrik had noticed her presence too. She could tell by the way his hammer strikes had become more measured, more controlled. He was finishing whatever piece he was working on with the same methodical care he had always brought to his craft. Even now, even knowing she was watching, he would not leave work half done. That was exactly the kind of man he was. The kind who finished what he started, who kept his word, who built things meant to last. It was what had made her fall in love with him 20 years ago, and it was what made him dangerous to her crown today. The irony was perfect and terrible. The qualities that had made him worthy of her love were the same ones that now made him a threat to her rule. His integrity had built him a following. His competence had earned him influence. His quiet strength had made him a leader whether he sought the role or not. And now she would have to use those same qualities against him, or watch them destroy everything she had spent 8 years building. She straightened her shoulders and began walking toward the forge, each step carrying her closer to a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. The wolf fur cloak whispered against the stone floor. The iron crown pressed cold against her temples, and somewhere in the depths of her chest, the heart she had thought she had trained to silence began to beat faster. 20 years ago, she had walked away from love to embrace duty. Today, she would discover whether it was possible to choose both, or whether some choices, once made, could never be unmade. The great hall held its breath as Queen Ragna approached the forge where Ulfrik waited. And in that suspended moment, the future of a kingdom balanced on the edge of words not yet spoken. The silence that fell over the great hall was absolute. Even the forge fire seemed to quiet its crackling as Queen Ragna stepped into the circle of light surrounding Ulfrik's workspace. Every conversation ceased, every tool was set aside, every breath held as the most powerful woman in the kingdom approached the man who had unknowingly become her greatest rival. Ulfrik set down his hammer with deliberate care and turned to face her. The years had been kind to him, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, his face lined with the marks of a man who had lived honestly and worked hard. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness, now held only the careful respect due to a queen. "Your Majesty," he said, offering the formal bow that protocol demanded. Around them, the gathered crowd dropped to their knees, but Ragna raised her hand to stop the gesture. "Rise," she commanded, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "This is not a formal audience. I come seeking honest words between old friends." The phrase, "old friends," rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Whispers began immediately. When had their queen and the blacksmith been friends? What history lay between them that the rest of the kingdom had never known? Ulfrik's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He knew exactly what game she was playing, and he was too intelligent not to understand the implications. "How may I serve the crown?" he asked, neither acknowledging nor denying the familiarity she had claimed. She had rehearsed this moment countless times. But standing here, looking into his face, all her carefully planned words seemed to crumble like poorly forged metal. Instead, the truth came out raw and unpolished. "You have built something impressive here," she said, gesturing to the expanded forge, the gathered workers, the obvious prosperity that marked his domain. "Your influence grows with each passing season. I'm a craftsman, Your Majesty. I serve those who need my skills, yes," she said softly, "and they have come to need you very much indeed." The crowd pressed closer, sensing something momentous in the careful dance of words between their queen and their local leader. Ragna could feel their attention like heat from the forge, burning against her skin. "Earl Magnus visited me last week," she continued, her voice pitched to carry. "He tells me that disputes in his territory are being brought to you for resolution rather than to his hall. That farmers seek your counsel on matters of trade and law." Ulfrik's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "People sometimes ask my opinion. I give it honestly, and they value that honesty above the wisdom of their appointed lords. It was a trap, and they both knew it. If he denied it, he would be lying. If he confirmed it, he would be admitting to undermining the established order. Ulfrik had always been too honest for politics, which made him both admirable and dangerous. I speak only of what I know," he said carefully. "Metalwork, trade, the concerns of common folk trying to make honest livings." "Common folk," she repeated, and something in her tone made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "Tell me, Ulfrik Ironright, when did you last consider yourself common?" The use of his full name, the title he had earned through skill rather than birth, sent another wave of murmurs through the hall. A queen did not learn a blacksmith's earned name unless that blacksmith had become more than merely common. "I am what I have always been, Your Majesty. Are you?" She took a step closer, close enough now that she could see the calluses on his hands, smell the honest scent of iron and fire that had always clung to him. "Because what I see is a man who owns more land than some of my earls, who employs more people than many noble houses, who commands more respect in his workshop than I do in my throne room." The words hung in the air like a blade, suspended over both their heads. She had just admitted in front of half her kingdom that her own authority was being questioned. It was either political suicide or the most dangerous gamble of her life. Ulfrik's eyes flashed with something, anger perhaps, or recognition of the impossible position she had just put him in. "Your Majesty, I have never sought—" "No," she interrupted, and now her voice carried the full weight of royal command. "You have never sought power. That is precisely what makes you so dangerous. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. She could see Earl Magnus's men among them, no doubt already planning how to report this conversation back to their lord. She could see merchants calculating how this confrontation might affect their trade agreements with both the crown and Ulfrik's operations. She could see the common folk trying to understand what this meant for their daily lives. But mostly, she could see Ulfrik trying to understand what she was really doing here. Dangerous to whom? He asked quietly. It was the right question, the one that cut to the heart of everything. She could give the political answer. Dangerous to the stability of the realm, to the established order, to the careful balance of power that kept the kingdom functioning. All of that would be true. Instead, she gave him the personal answer. To me, 2 words that changed everything. In admitting that Ulfrik posed a personal threat, she had revealed far more than any queen should reveal. She had shown weakness, vulnerability, a crack in the armor of royal composure that she had worn for 8 years. But she had also shown truth. And truth had a power all its own. "Your Majesty," Ulfrik began. But she held up her hand. "I did not come here for explanations or apologies," she said. "I came here with a proposition." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a scroll sealed with royal wax. The sight of it made several people in the crowd step back. Formal documents from the crown were rarely good news for common folk. "This is a writ of seizure," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It grants me the legal authority to claim, in the name of the crown, any holdings that represent a threat to the stability of the realm." Ulfrik's face went very still. Around them, the crowd began to murmur with real fear now. If the queen could seize Ulfrik's holdings, what did that mean for their own small properties, their own livelihoods? "Everything you have built," she continued, "your forges, your lands, your workshops, the houses you have purchased for your workers, all of it can be claimed by the crown with my signature on this document." She held the scroll up, letting everyone see the royal seal that would make it legally binding. "However," she said, and the single word stopped every sound in the hall, "I am prepared to offer an alternative." This was it. The moment she had planned for, prepared for, dreaded for weeks. The moment that would either save her kingdom or destroy it completely. "Wed me," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the hammering of her heart. "Become my king consort. Bind your strength to my crown. And everything you have built will not only remain yours, it will become the foundation of a new kind of rule." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the wind moving through the rafters high above. Then, like a dam breaking, the crowd erupted. Voices rose in shock, excitement, fear, speculation. Some called out their approval, others their dismay. A few simply stared in stunned disbelief, but Ulfrik said nothing. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers, and in that moment she saw him truly understand what she had done. She had not just proposed marriage, she had declared war on the established order of things. She had chosen him over every earl, every foreign king, every politically advantageous alliance her advisors had spent years arranging. She had chosen love over duty, or found a way to make them the same thing. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the crowd's noise. She raised the scroll again, letting the royal seal catch the firelight. "Then you lose everything you own." The crowd fell silent again, understanding finally dawning on their faces. This was not a proposal, it was an ultimatum. Their queen had just backed the most powerful man in their kingdom into a corner, and everyone present would live with the consequences of his choice. Ulfrik looked at her for a long moment, and she saw 20 years of history pass between them, the boy and girl by the river, the promises they had made, the paths that had led them to this impossible moment. "You would force this?" he asked. "I would save my kingdom," she replied. "The only question is whether you will help me do it as my husband, or watch me do it over your exile." The words fell like a blade between them, cutting through whatever remained of the tenderness they had once shared. This was no longer about love or even about politics. This was about survival, hers, his, and the kingdom's, and in the silence that followed, With half the realm watching and waiting, Queen Ragna discovered that some choices, once made, could never be unmade. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring drawn taut, ready to snap. Ulfrik's eyes never left Ragna's face as he processed the magnitude of what she had just demanded. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something that would be spoken of for generations. "I need time," Ulfrik said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that his next words would shape the fate of everyone in the hall. "Time is a luxury neither of us possesses," Ragna replied, though something in her expression softened slightly. "Earl Magnus rides to the capital tomorrow with demands that I address your growing influence. Other earls will follow. If I appear weak, if I seem unable to control the situation, they will act without me." She tucked the scroll back into her cloak, but the threat it represented still hung heavy in the air. "I offer you until sunset tomorrow to decide. After that, the choice will be made for both of us." Ulfrik nodded slowly, accepting the deadline with the same methodical consideration he brought to his metalwork. "And if I agree to this marriage, what assurances do I have that this is not simply a more elaborate form of seizure? What protection exists for those who have tied their fortunes to mine?" It was a shrewd question, one that revealed the depth of his transformation from simple craftsman to leader. He was not thinking only of himself, but of the dozens of families whose livelihoods depended on his operations. "Your people become my people," Ragna said, raising her voice so the entire hall could hear. "Any man or woman employed in your workshops, any family living on lands you have developed, any merchant who has prospered through trade with your enterprises, all would be under the direct protection of the crown." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. She was offering them something their noble lords rarely provided, security that was guaranteed not by the whims of a single earl, but by the royal house itself. "And my own authority," Ulfrik pressed. "I assume you do not intend for me to become merely a figurehead while my life's work is absorbed into the royal household." The question cut to the heart of what this marriage would actually mean. Would he be a true partner in rule, or simply a convenient solution to a political problem? Ragna took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would commit her to a course she had only begun to fully consider. "You would be my king consort with all the authority that title carries. Your counsel would guide my decisions. Your expertise would strengthen the kingdom's prosperity. You would rule beside me, not beneath me." Several people in the crowd gasped at this. No queen in living memory had offered to share actual power with a husband, especially not one risen from common birth. Royal marriages typically elevated the spouse in title only. The real authority remained firmly with the blood heir. Earl Magnus's men were scribbling notes frantically now, documenting every word for their lord's review. This conversation was already reshaping the political landscape of the kingdom, regardless of Ulfrik's ultimate decision. "There is another matter we must discuss," Ulfrik said, his voice dropping lower. "One that perhaps should not be aired before the entire kingdom." Ragna understood immediately what he meant. The personal history between them, the emotional weight that made this more than a political arrangement. The questions about what their marriage would truly entail. These were conversations that belonged in private chambers, not public halls. "Indeed," she agreed. "But the public matter must be settled first. The kingdom must know whether you will accept my offer. Then I will give you my answer tomorrow, before sunset," Ulfrik said formally. In this same hall, before these same witnesses, it was perfectly reasonable, exactly what she had requested, but something in his tone made her chest tighten with unease. There was a finality to his words that suggested he had already made his decision and was simply observing the proper forms. "Very well," she said, matching his formal tone. "Until tomorrow, then." She turned to leave, but Ulfrik's voice stopped her. "Your Majesty," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her title that made her look back. "I hope you understand what you are asking of me. What you are asking of both of us." For just a moment, the careful political mask slipped from her face, and he saw the uncertainty beneath. "I understand that I'm asking you to trust me with your life's work. I hope you understand that I'm trusting you with mine." Their eyes met across the space between them, and 20 years collapsed into nothing. For an instant they were not queen and subject, not political rivals calculating advantage, but simply two people who had once loved each other enough to dream of a different life. Then the moment passed, and Queen Ragna walked away without another word, her wolf fur cloak billowing behind her, her iron crown glinting in the firelight. The crowd parted before her, offering the deep bows she had not demanded earlier, and watched in hushed silence as she disappeared into the shadows beyond the great hall. Ulfrik remained by his forge long after she had gone, staring into the coals that still glowed with banked fire. Around him, the normal sounds of the hall gradually resumed. Conversations, tools being gathered, children being called to their mothers' sides. But the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. Everyone present knew they had witnessed history being made, though none could yet say what shape that history would take. Bjorn, the Queen's guard, had followed her at a discreet distance, but he paused at the hall's entrance to look back at Ulfrik. The old warrior had seen enough of politics to recognize a man wrestling with an impossible choice. His weathered face showed something that might have been sympathy before he turned and followed his queen into the night. As the crowd began to disperse, several of Ulfrik's closest associates approached the forge. These were men who had risen with him, whose own fortunes were tied to his success, and their faces showed the strain of uncertainty. "What will you do?" asked Torsten, his workshop foreman and oldest friend. Ulfrik lifted a piece of iron from the forge, studying its surface for flaws in the way he had done 10,000 times before. The metal was honest. It showed you exactly what it was, held no secrets, made no impossible demands. "I will think," he said simply, "and tomorrow I will choose." But even as he spoke the words, Ulfrik knew the choice had already been made the moment Queen Ragna stepped into his hall. The only question now was whether he could find the courage to embrace a future he had never imagined, or whether the weight of the past would crush them both. The royal chambers felt smaller than usual as Queen Ragna paced before the great hearth, her advisors seated around the oak table that had witnessed countless strategy sessions. The fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting the concern etched in every line and wrinkle. These were men who had served her father before her, who had guided her through the treacherous early years of her reign, and who now watched their carefully ordered world teetering on the edge of chaos. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Ulfrik began, his voice carefully measured, "perhaps we should discuss the implications of today's announcement." Ragna paused in her pacing to study the elderly man who had been her father's most trusted advisor. Ulfrik had taught her statecraft, had shown her how to read the subtle currents of court politics, had helped her navigate the dangerous waters of early queenship. His disapproval now was evident in every careful word. "Speak plainly, old friend," she said. "We are beyond the need for diplomatic language." "Very well." Ulfrik straightened in his chair, assuming the posture of a man delivering unwelcome but necessary truth. "What you propose today violates every precedent of royal marriage. A blacksmith, regardless of his current wealth, cannot simply be elevated to king consort. The nobility will never accept it." "The nobility," interrupted Lord Commander Eric, "will do more than disapprove. Earl Magnus has already sent riders to the other earls. By tomorrow evening you may face a united front demanding that you reconsider." Ragna resumed her pacing, her boots clicking against the stone floor with rhythmic precision. "And if I refuse to reconsider?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Her advisors exchanged glances that spoke of civil war, of a kingdom torn apart by competing loyalties, of everything they had worked to build crumbling into ruin. "There are other solutions," suggested Master Gorvain, the kingdom's treasurer. "Ulfrik's holdings could be redistributed, divided among loyal earls who would ensure proper governance. His people would still be protected, but the threat to royal authority would be eliminated." "You mean destroy him?" Ragna said flatly. Strip away everything he has built and scatter his supporters to prevent them from uniting under another leader. It is what any prudent ruler would do, Gorvain replied. The man has grown too powerful for a subject. That is simply political reality. Ragna stopped pacing and turned to face them fully. In the firelight, her iron crown seemed to glow with its own inner heat, and something in her expression made even these seasoned advisers shift uncomfortably. "And what of loyalty?" she asked quietly. "What of the fact that Ulfrik has done nothing but serve his people well, build prosperity where there was none, and earn respect through honest work? What message does it send to destroy a man for the crime of competence?" "It sends the message," Chancellor Ulfrik said firmly, "that the crown remains supreme, that no subject, however capable, may challenge royal authority. He has not challenged my authority. You have said so yourselves. He seeks no titles, makes no claims, builds no armies. His only crime is being good at what he does." Lord Commander Eric leaned forward, his scarred face serious. "Your Majesty, intention matters less than perception. If the earls believe he threatens their positions, if they see the common folk turning to him instead of their appointed lords, then he has already challenged the established order, whether he meant to or not. It was a fair point, one that Ragna had wrestled with herself. But fairness and justice were not always the same thing, and she had spent 8 years learning the difference. "Tell me about the northern clans," she said suddenly, changing direction in a way that left her advisers blinking in confusion. "Your Majesty," Ulfrik asked. "The northern clans who sent me this cloak," she said, touching the wolf fur draped across her shoulders. "What do our reports say about their current loyalties?" Master Gorvain shuffled through his papers with obvious reluctance. "The northern clans remain autonomous. They honor the ancient treaties, pay their required tributes, but they govern themselves according to their own customs. And those customs include marrying for strength rather than bloodline, do they not?" "Yes, and they have prospered under this system. Their territories are secure, their people fed, their warriors loyal." "Your Majesty," Chancellor Ulfrik interrupted, "you cannot seriously be considering adopting northern customs for the royal house. The southern earls would revolt immediately." Ragna smiled, and there was something dangerous in the expression. "The southern earls are already planning revolt, Ulfrik. At least this way, I gain powerful allies in the north while neutralizing the threat from within." She moved to the window that overlooked the great hall below. Even at this late hour, she could see lights still burning in Ulfrik's workshop. The man was probably working through the night, as he did when wrestling with difficult problems. She remembered that about him, how he would stay at his forge until dawn when something troubled him, working out his thoughts with hammer and anvil. "There is something else to consider," she said, without turning from the window. "Something none of you have mentioned." "What is that, Your Majesty?" Eric asked. "I'm 32 years old. I've ruled for 8 years without taking a husband, and in that time I have received exactly 43 formal proposals of marriage from foreign kings, neighboring lords, and ambitious earls." She turned back to face them, and her expression was utterly serious now. "Not one of those proposals was made because the man in question loved me. Not one was offered because he believed I was worthy of devotion. Every single offer was made because marrying me meant gaining a crown, controlling a kingdom, or securing an alliance." The advisers shifted uncomfortably, unable to deny the truth of her words. "Ulfrik Ironright," she continued, "is the only man in this kingdom who knew me before I wore a crown, the only one who cared for me when I had nothing to offer but myself. If I must marry for political reasons, and you have all made it clear that I must, then I choose to marry the one man who wanted me before he could gain anything from the match, Your Majesty." Ulfrik said gently, "That was 20 years ago. You are both different people now." "Yes," she agreed, "we are. But some foundations once laid remain solid despite the storms that follow." She moved to the table where her advisers sat and placed both hands on its surface. Leaning forward with the intensity of a general planning a crucial battle, "Here is what will happen," she said. Tomorrow, Ulfrik will accept my proposal because he understands what I understand, that the kingdom faces threats greater than our personal desires. We will marry within the month, combining our strengths to create something stronger than either of us could build alone. The northern clans will support us because they respect strength over birthright. The common people will support us because they have seen what Ulfrik can accomplish. And the earls will support us because they will have no choice. And if they refuse, Eric asked. Ragna straightened, and in that moment, she looked every inch the queen her father had raised her to be. Then they will learn that some storms, once unleashed, cannot be controlled by those who failed to read the wind. Dawn broke grey and cold over the kingdom, matching the uncertainty that hung in the air like morning mist. Word of the Queen's ultimatum had spread beyond the Great Hall, carried by merchants and travellers to every corner of the realm. In taverns and market squares, common folk debated what it might mean for their daily lives. In noble halls, earls and their advisers calculated the implications for their own power. Ulfrik had not slept. He stood now at the edge of his property, where the land sloped down toward the river that marked the boundary of his holdings. This was where it had all begun 20 years ago, when a blacksmith's apprentice had met a king's daughter and dared to dream of impossible things. The river looked the same, crystal clear water running over smooth stones, willows trailing their branches in the current, the soft sound of moving water that had provided the soundtrack to so many stolen conversations. But everything else had changed beyond recognition. Where once there had been a simple path through wild grass, now a well-maintained road led to a bridge he had built with his own hands. Where once the land had been empty meadow, now workshops and houses dotted the landscape, home to the families who had found prosperity in his expanding enterprises. What had been wilderness was now a thriving community, and he was responsible for all of it. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. These people had trusted him, had bet their futures on his success, had built their lives around the stability he provided. Now their queen was asking him to risk everything they had achieved for a chance at something greater, or perhaps something far more dangerous. Footsteps on the path behind him announced the arrival of visitors. Ulfrik turned to see three figures approaching: Torsten, his longtime foreman; Astrid, the merchant who managed his trade relationships; and Father Benedict, the priest who served the small chapel Ulfrik had commissioned for his workers' families. These three represented the different aspects of his life: craft, commerce, and community. Their faces showed the strain of a sleepless night spent worrying about futures that hung in the balance. "We need to talk," Torsten said without preamble. The older man's weathered face was grim with concern. "People are asking questions we cannot answer." "What kind of questions?" Ulfrik asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Whether they should pack their belongings," Astrid replied, her voice sharp with worry. "Whether the Queen means to honor her promises to protect our interests. Whether you have any real choice in this matter, or if we are all just pieces in a game we do not understand." Father Benedict stepped forward, his expression more thoughtful than fearful. "I have been counseling families since before dawn. They trust you, Ulfrik, but they are afraid. They have built good lives here, and the prospect of losing everything terrifies them." Ulfrik nodded slowly, understanding the pressure they were under. These people had chosen to follow him not because of his birth or title, but because he had proven himself worthy of their trust. Now that trust was being tested in ways none of them had anticipated. "What do you know of Queen Ragna?" he asked them. "Not the stories or rumors, but what have you observed of her rule?" The three exchanged glances before Astrid spoke. "She is fair in her dealings with merchants. Taxation is reasonable, trade disputes are settled justly, and she has kept the peace for 8 years. She expanded the kingdom's trade relationships," Torsten added. "My brother works in the capital shipyards. They have never been busier. People have work, and work means food on the table." Father Benedict was quiet for a moment before offering his perspective. "I hear confessions from nobles when they travel through our region. The Queen is not beloved by all her earls. They find her too independent, too unwilling to grant them the privileges they believe their birth entitles them to. And what do you make of her proposal? Ulfrik asked directly. I think, Father Benedict said carefully, that desperate times sometimes require desperate measures. The question is whether this desperation comes from strength or weakness. It was a perceptive observation, one that cut to the heart of Ulfrik's own uncertainty. Was Ragna acting from a position of confidence, seizing an opportunity to reshape the kingdom according to her vision? Or was she being forced into an impossible choice by circumstances beyond her control? There is something else, Astrid said hesitantly. Riders came through the market this morning. Earl Magnus has called a gathering of the southern lords. They plan to meet tomorrow to discuss the situation. Ulfrik felt his jaw tighten. If the earls were mobilizing against the Queen's decision, then the political crisis was escalating faster than anyone had anticipated. How many earls? He asked. 5, possibly 6, Torsten replied. Enough to make their displeasure significant. The implications were clear. If half the kingdom's nobility united in opposition to the Queen's marriage plan, it would create exactly the kind of instability that enemies, both internal and external, could exploit. What would you have me do? Ulfrik asked them directly. Speak honestly. Your futures depend on my choice as much as mine depends on it. The three conferred in, whispered. A conversation before Father Benedict stepped forward as their spokesman. We have discussed this throughout the night, he said. If you refuse the Queen's offer, we believe she will carry out her threat. Our prosperity, our homes, our way of life, all of it will be destroyed to eliminate you as a political threat. And if I accept, then we become part of something larger, Astrid said. Our success becomes the kingdom's success. Our security is guaranteed not by your protection alone, but by the crown itself. But, Torsten added grimly, we also become targets. Every earl who opposes this marriage will see us as symbols of everything they despise about the changing order. We gain royal protection, but we also gain powerful enemies. Ulfrik turned back to look at the river, remembering the girl who had once sat on its banks and dreamed aloud about ruling differently than her father. She had spoken of merit over birth, of service over privilege, of building a kingdom where worth was measured by what people contributed rather than what they inherited. She meant it, he said quietly, more to himself than to his companions. Sir? Torsten asked. 20 years ago she told me she wanted to change how things were done. I thought it was just youthful idealism, the kind of dreams young people have before the world teaches them reality. But she meant it. He turned back to face them, and they saw something new in his expression, not just resolve but understanding. This is not about me, he said. This is not even about us. This is about whether the kingdom will continue to be ruled by the same families, in the same ways, for the same purposes, or whether it can become something different. And you believe it can? Father Benedict asked. Ulfrik was quiet for a long moment, watching the morning sun burn through the mist above the river. I believe, he said finally, that some chances, once offered, never come again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the royal gardens as Queen Ragna walked among the herb beds her mother had planted 30 years ago. The familiar sense of lavender and rosemary should have brought comfort, but today they only reminded her of all the peaceful moments she might be sacrificing for an uncertain future. A soft footstep on the gravel path announced the arrival of her oldest friend and most trusted confidant. Lady Maren had served as her companion since childhood, one of the few people who remembered the girl behind the crown. The northern messengers have arrived, Maren said, without preamble. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to navigate court politics without ever losing her essential kindness. And their response? Ragna asked, though she tried to keep the eagerness from her voice. Jarl Eriksson sends his congratulations on your engagement and pledges the full support of the northern clans. He seems pleased by your choice. Ragna allowed herself a small smile. The Northern Alliance was crucial. Their warriors were fierce, their territories secure, and their acceptance of merit-based leadership would provide legitimacy for what she was attempting. He also sent this, Maren continued, withdrawing a small wooden box from her robes. A wedding gift, he said, though he hopes you will forgive the presumption. Ragna opened the box to reveal a simple silver pendant in the shape of two wolves running side by side. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master silversmith. But the design spoke of partnership rather than dominance. The northern way, she murmured, understanding the symbolism immediately. In northern culture, marriage was viewed as an alliance between equals, a joining of strength that benefited both parties. There is other news, Maren said, her tone becoming more serious. Earl Magnus has indeed gathered the southern lords. Our spies report that 6 earls have committed to attending his gathering, with 2 more likely to join them. 8 earls, Ragna said quietly. Nearly half the kingdom's nobility. They are calling it a council of concerned lords, Maren continued. Officially, they claim to be discussing trade agreements and border security. Unofficially, they are planning either to force me to reconsider or to replace me with someone more amenable to their interests. The 2 women walked in silence for several minutes, each lost in contemplation of the crisis building around them. The garden that had always been Ragna's refuge now felt like a prison, beautiful but isolated from the real world, where decisions had consequences and choices carried the weight of thousands of lives. Maren, Ragna said finally, I need you to answer a question honestly as my friend rather than my subject. Always. Am I being foolish? Am I letting personal feelings cloud my judgment about what is best for the kingdom? Maren stopped walking and turned to face her queen directly. Her expression was thoughtful, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think, she said carefully, that you are being brave enough to try something that has never been tried before. Whether that makes you wise or foolish will depend on whether it works. That is not particularly reassuring. You did not ask for reassurance. You asked for honesty. Ragna nodded, appreciating the distinction. What do you think of Ulfrik? You knew him before, when we were young. I remember a boy who treated the king's daughter with respect, but not reverence, who argued with you when he thought you were wrong, but never tried to diminish you, who made you laugh more genuinely than anyone before or since. And now? Now I see a man who has built something remarkable from nothing, who inspires loyalty without demanding it, who has grown into his strength without losing his essential character. Maren paused, choosing her next words carefully. I also see a man who still looks at you the way he did 20 years ago, despite everything that has passed between then and now. The observation struck Ragna unexpectedly. She had been so focused on the political implications of her proposal that she had barely allowed herself to consider the personal ones. What would it mean to marry a man she had once loved? Could those feelings be rekindled? Or would the weight of crown and responsibility crush anything tender that remained between them? The earls will not accept him, she said, returning to safer political ground. The earls do not accept you either, Maren replied bluntly. They tolerate you because you are your father's daughter and because you have given them no choice. But they have never truly accepted a woman's rule, and they certainly do not accept your independence. It was true, though Ragna rarely allowed herself to acknowledge it so directly. Her entire reign had been a careful balance between asserting her authority and avoiding the kind of confrontation that might unite the nobility against her. Perhaps that is the real problem, she said thoughtfully. I have spent 8 years trying to rule in a way that would not threaten them too much. Trying to be strong enough to command respect, but not so strong as to provoke rebellion. And has that strategy been successful? Ragna considered the question seriously. It has kept the peace. It has maintained stability, but it has also left me isolated, always watching for signs of disloyalty, always calculating how much I can push before they push back. And now I am tired of being careful. Tired of measuring every decision against their potential disapproval. tired of ruling as if I am a guest in my own kingdom. They had reached the center of the garden, where a fountain played softly in the afternoon light. The sound of moving water reminded Ragna of the river where she and Ulfrik had once planned a different future, and she found herself wondering if that future might still be possible. "There is something else," Marin said quietly. "Something I think you should know before you make your final decision." "What is it?" "This morning, I received a message from my cousin in Earl Magnus's household. The Earls are not simply planning to oppose your marriage. They are discussing the possibility of declaring you unfit to rule." The words hit Ragna like a physical blow. Being declared unfit would mean deposition, exile, possibly death if they decided she posed a continuing threat. On what grounds? Emotional instability. They would claim that your proposal to Ulfrik proves you are making decisions based on personal feelings rather than political wisdom. Ragna felt a cold fury building in her chest. After 8 years of careful, measured rule, they would use the first genuinely bold decision she had made as evidence of unfitness. "They have been planning this," she said with sudden clarity. "This is not a reaction to my proposal. This is an opportunity they have been waiting for. I believe you are right. The question now is what you intend to do about it." Ragna stood silently by the fountain, watching the water catch and scatter the afternoon light. The silver pendant from the northern Jarl felt warm in her palm, its twin wolves a reminder that some alliances were worth fighting for. "I intend," she said finally, "to give them exactly the kind of queen they claim to fear." The sun hung low on the western horizon as Queen Ragna returned to the great hall for Ulfrik's answer. The same crowd had gathered, perhaps larger now, as word had spread throughout the day, but the atmosphere felt different, charged, dangerous. She could sense the undercurrents of tension that spoke of a kingdom balanced. On the edge of transformation or catastrophe, Ulfrik stood in his usual place by the forge, but he was not alone. Arranged behind him were representatives from every major trade guild, the heads of farming families whose lands bordered his, the craftsmen who had prospered under his guidance, and even several minor nobles whose small holdings had benefited from his expansion of commerce. The sight stopped Ragna in her tracks. This was not simply a blacksmith giving an answer to his queen. This was a leader surrounded by his people, a man who commanded genuine loyalty, presenting a united front. "Your Majesty," Ulfrik said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I have considered your proposal with the weight it deserves." He stepped forward, and the crowd behind him moved as one, maintaining their formation. It was a subtle display of solidarity that sent its own message. Whatever Ulfrik decided, he would not be standing alone. "I accept," he said simply. The hall erupted in cheers from some quarters, murmurs of concern from others. But Ragna found herself studying Ulfrik's face, looking for the reluctance or resignation she had expected to find there. Instead, she saw something that surprised her, determination mixed with what might have been anticipation. "However," Ulfrik continued, and the single word cut through the noise like a blade, "I have conditions." The hall fell silent again. Conditions? A blacksmith was proposing conditions to a queen's offer of marriage. The audacity of it should have been insulting, but something in Ulfrik's manner suggested this was not about challenging her authority. "Speak them," Ragna said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Ulfrik reached into his leather apron and withdrew a document, not a scroll like hers, but a simple piece of parchment covered in precise handwriting. "First," he said, "this marriage will be a true partnership. I will not be a figurehead husband who provides legitimacy while you retain all real power. If you want my strength to support your crown, then my counsel must carry weight in your decisions." It was exactly what she had offered, but hearing him state it as a condition rather than accepting it as a gift changed the dynamic entirely. He was not being elevated by her grace. He was entering into a contract between equals. "Second," he continued, "the people who have trusted me with their livelihoods will be protected not just in law, but in practice. No earl, no matter how offended by this marriage, will be permitted to retaliate against those who have supported me. Again, she had already promised this, but his phrasing made it clear he expected her to enforce it actively, not merely declare it legally. And third, Ulfrik said, his voice dropping to carry a new intensity, we will rule together, but we will also discover together whether what existed between us 20 years ago can exist again today. The personal condition, stated publicly, sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. This was no longer just a political arrangement. It was an acknowledgement that their shared past would shape their shared future. Those conditions are acceptable, Ragna said formally. Then, allowing a small smile to cross her face, she added, I would have been disappointed with anything less. But even as the crowd began to react to the acceptance, a commotion at the hall's entrance drew everyone's attention. The great doors swung open to admit a party of armed riders, their horses steaming in the cool evening air. At their head rode Earl Magnus himself, his face grim with purpose. Your Majesty, Magnus called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I demand an audience. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Magnus had arrived at exactly the moment when Ulfrik's acceptance would have sealed their arrangement, when the political transformation would have become irreversible. Earl Magnus, Ragna replied calmly, though her mind was racing through the implications of his arrival. You are welcome in my hall, as always. Magnus dismounted and strode forward, his retinue spreading out behind him in a formation that looked suspiciously military. As he approached, Ragna could see other figures among his men, representatives from the southern earls. Their faces set with the determination of men who had come to deliver an ultimatum of their own. I bring greetings from the Council of Southern Lords, Magnus announced, his voice pitched to carry throughout the hall. We have met in emergency session to address the crisis facing our kingdom. Crisis? Ragna asked, raising an eyebrow. I was not aware of any crisis beyond the normal challenges of governance. The crisis, Magnus said, stopping directly in front of her, is the Queen's apparent inability to distinguish between personal desire and political necessity. The insult was delivered with the precision of a sword thrust, designed to provoke a reaction that would support whatever case the earls had prepared. Continue, Ragna said calmly. Refusing to take the bait, Magnus withdrew his own scroll, larger and more ornate than either of the documents already presented that evening. By the authority granted to us under the ancient laws of succession, we hereby declare Queen Ragna unfit to rule by reason of emotional instability and political incompetence. The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled crowd. Several people gasped audibly, while others pressed closer to ensure they heard correctly. Furthermore, Magnus continued, we demand that she abdicate in favor of a regency council composed of the senior earls, who will govern until a suitable male heir can be identified and crowned. The challenge was complete and devastating. Not only were they rejecting her marriage proposal, they were rejecting her right to rule at all. But instead of the shock or anger Magnus clearly expected, Ragna began to laugh. The sound started as a quiet chuckle, but grew into something richer, more genuine, until it filled the hall with unexpected warmth. Earl Magnus, she said when her laughter finally subsided, you have just provided me with the perfect wedding gift. The confusion on Magnus's face was almost comical. Your Majesty, you see, Ragna continued, her voice carrying new strength, I have spent 8 years trying to rule in a way that would not threaten you and your fellow earls too much, trying to balance your interests with the kingdom's needs, trying to maintain stability by avoiding the very confrontation you have now forced. She stepped closer to Magnus, and something in her bearing made the armed men behind him shift nervously. But you have just made it clear that no amount of careful diplomacy will satisfy you, that you will accept nothing less than my complete submission or removal, which means I am finally free to stop trying to accommodate you. Magnus's face was growing darker as he began to understand what she was saying. By attempting to depose me tonight, Ragna continued, You have committed treason. By bringing armed men into my hall to threaten your lawful queen, you have declared war. And by doing both in front of witnesses from across the kingdom, you have made it impossible for anyone to claim this conflict arose from my actions rather than yours." She turned to address the entire hall, her voice carrying the full authority of 8 years of rulership. "Let all present bear witness. The southern earls have rejected not just my marriage plans, but my right to rule. They offer the kingdom nothing but a return to the failed policies that left us weak and divided. We offer them partnership in a stronger future, but if they choose conflict instead, then conflict they shall have." The hall was utterly silent now, everyone understanding that they had just witnessed the moment when careful political maneuvering gave way to open confrontation. "Earl Magnus," Ragna said, her voice deadly quiet, "you have 1 hour to withdraw your men from my lands and return to your holdings. After that, you will be considered enemies of the crown, and we will treat you accordingly." Magnus's face had gone white with rage, but he was trapped by his own overreach. He had expected to cow her into submission with his show of force. Instead, he had provided her with legal justification for everything that would follow. "This is not over," he said through gritted teeth. "No," Ragna agreed, and her smile was sharp as winter steel. "It is just beginning." The great hall had transformed into a war council within hours of Earl Magnus's departure. The long tables that usually hosted feasts now bore maps, supply lists, and messages from allies across the kingdom. Queen Ragna stood at the center of it all, no longer the careful diplomat who had ruled for 8 years, but a warrior queen preparing for the fight that would determine the future of her realm. Ulfrik moved through the controlled chaos with quiet efficiency, his experience managing complex operations proving invaluable in organizing the rapid mobilization. The man who had spent decades coordinating smiths, merchants, and farmers was applying those same skills to coordinating soldiers, supplies, and strategy. "The northern clans have responded faster than we hoped," reported Lord Commander Eric, his scarred face showing satisfaction despite the gravity of the situation. "Jarl Eriksson himself leads 3,000 warriors south. They should reach our borders within 5 days, and the southern earls?" Ragna asked, studying the map where colored pins marked the positions of various forces. "Magnus has gathered nearly 4,000 men at Thornfield," Eric replied. "Our scouts report that Earl Aldwin brings another 1,500, Earl Garrett nearly 1,000. They are consolidating their forces for a single decisive battle, rather than spreading themselves across multiple fronts." Ulfrik approached the table, his own intelligence to add. "The merchants are split," he said. "Those whose fortunes are tied to trade with the northern territories support us. Those who depend on the southern agricultural regions remain neutral or lean toward Magnus." "And the common folk?" Ragna asked. "They remember which lords have been fair in their taxation and which have been harsh," Ulfrik replied with a slight smile. "Your popularity among the farming communities may surprise the earls." Father Benedict hurried into the hall, carrying a leather satchel filled with messages. The priest had proven unexpectedly valuable as a coordinator of intelligence, his network of churches providing communication across the kingdom. "Your Majesty," he said, slightly out of breath, "I bring word from the capital. Chancellor Aldrich and the court have declared their loyalty to the crown. The royal treasury and armory are secure." Relief flickered across Ragna's face. Control of the capital and its resources was crucial, and the loyalty of the established court provided legitimacy for her cause. "However," Benedict continued, "and there are disturbing reports from the eastern borders. Foreign merchants speak of unusual military activity in the neighboring kingdoms. It appears our conflict has not gone unnoticed beyond our borders." The implications sent a chill through the assembled leaders. A kingdom divided against itself was vulnerable to external threats, and their neighbors had not forgotten old territorial disputes that a weakened realm might be unable to defend. "How long before Magnus feels strong enough to move?" Ragna asked Eric. 3 days, perhaps 4. He will want to consolidate his forces and ensure his supply lines are secure before advancing. Then we have 3 days to complete our own preparations. Ragna turned to address the entire group. Ulfrik, I need you to coordinate with your trade contacts. Every wagon, every riverboat, every pack animal that can move supplies needs to be secured for our use. Already in progress, he replied. The advantage of dealing with merchants is that they understand the value of being on the winning side of any conflict. Lady Marin approached with a small group of noble women, their fine clothes replaced with practical traveling garments. Your Majesty, we have organized the evacuation of non-combatants from the likely battle zones. The women and children from the border areas are being moved to secure locations. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful preparation that distinguished Ragna's leadership from the more traditional approach of simply gathering armies and charging forward. She understood that modern warfare affected entire populations, not just the men who carried swords. What of our wedding plans? Ulfrik asked quietly. Stepping closer to speak privately with her, Ragna paused in her review of supply reports to consider the question seriously. A queen who marries on the eve of battle either shows supreme confidence or supreme foolishness. And which would this be? Both, I think. She looked up at him, seeing in his face the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that she felt in her own heart. Are you prepared to be crowned king consort tomorrow and lead men into battle the day after? Are you prepared to marry a man who might be dead within a week? The blunt question hung between them, acknowledging the reality they both faced. This was no fairy tale where love conquered all. This was a desperate gamble with their lives, their kingdom, and their future hanging in the balance. I've been preparing for that possibility since I first wore this crown, she said quietly. The question is whether you are prepared to die for a kingdom that may never fully accept you as its king. Ulfrik was quiet for a long moment, watching the organized preparations swirling around them. Messengers coming and going, soldiers checking equipment, civilians organizing supplies, all of it set in motion by decisions they had made together. 20 years ago, he said finally, you told me that some dreams were worth fighting for, even if you never achieved them. I think you were right then, and I think you are right now. Before Ragna could respond, a commotion at the hall's entrance announced the arrival of another messenger. This one rode hard, his horse lathered with sweat and his own clothes dust-covered from urgent travel. Your Majesty, the messenger called out, dropping to one knee as soon as he dismounted. I bring word from the western borders. Speak, Ragna commanded, though she dreaded what news could have prompted such haste. The kingdom of Westmarch has mobilized an army. 20,000 men march toward our borders under the banner of King Thormund. Their stated intention is to restore order and legitimate rule to our kingdom. The silence that followed was absolute. 20,000 foreign soldiers represented a force larger than both sides of their civil war combined. If Westmarch intervened in their conflict, it would not matter who won the battle between Ragna and Magnus. They would all become subjects of a foreign king. How long until they reach our borders? Eric asked, his voice tight with professional concern. 4 days, perhaps 5 if the weather holds. Ragna felt the weight of the crown press down on her temples like a physical burden. In trying to save her kingdom from internal division, she had attracted external conquest. The very conflict meant to preserve their independence might now destroy it completely. There is more, the messenger continued reluctantly. King Thormund has declared that he will recognize Earl Magnus as the legitimate ruler of our kingdom, and that his army comes at Magnus's invitation. The betrayal cut deeper than any military threat. Magnus had not just rebelled against his queen, he had invited foreign conquest to achieve his goals. He was willing to see their kingdom absorbed into a larger empire rather than accept Ragna's rule. Summon the council, Ragna said, her voice deadly calm. We face a new war now. As the advisors gathered around the map table, Ulfrik moved to stand beside her. His presence was steadying, a reminder that whatever they faced, they would face it together. "Can we defeat 20,000 foreign soldiers?" he asked quietly. "Not in direct battle," she admitted. "But we might not have to." She pointed to the map, her finger tracing the mountain passes that controlled access to their kingdom from the west. "If we can defeat Magnus quickly, before Westmarch arrives, then we face them with a united kingdom rather than a divided one. And a united kingdom defending its homeland has advantages that no invading army can match. And if we cannot defeat Magnus quickly?" Ragna looked up at him, and for a moment the careful mask of royal composure slipped, revealing the uncertainty beneath. "Then we discover whether love and courage are enough to save a kingdom from the consequences of its queen's choices." Outside the hall, the sun was setting on what might be the last peaceful night their kingdom would know for a very long time. Tomorrow would bring a wedding, and the day after would bring war. Whether either of them would survive to see the outcome remained a question that only battle could answer. Dawn broke blood-red over the battlefield at Thornfield, where two armies faced each other across a valley that would soon be soaked with the blood of a kingdom's internal strife. Queen Ragna sat astride her warhorse, the ancient crown of her ancestors replaced by a battle helm that gleamed silver in the morning light. Beside her, King Consort Ulfrik, crowned just 12 hours earlier in a ceremony that had lasted mere minutes, adjusted his grip on the warhammer he had forged himself. Their wedding had been unlike any in the kingdom's history. No grand cathedral, no elaborate feast, no weeks of celebration. Instead, Father Benedict had performed the ceremony in the Great Hall by torchlight, with soldiers and craftsmen as witnesses, while scouts brought reports of enemy movements. The rings they exchanged were simple iron bands that Ulfrik had crafted during the brief hours between the wedding and the march to battle. "Still time to change your mind about this," Ulfrik murmured, his eyes scanning the opposing army that stretched across the valley floor below them. "About the marriage or the battle?" Ragna asked, checking the tension on her bowstring one final time. "Both." She turned to look at him fully, taking in the sight of the man who had transformed from blacksmith to king in a single day. The wedding ceremony had been brief, but the moment when he had knelt to accept the crown, Consort, had felt more real, more significant than all the pageantry of her own coronation years before. The time pressure was enormous. They needed to defeat Magnus decisively and quickly, then turn to face a foreign invasion while their own forces were bloodied and exhausted from civil war. "Begin the advance," Ragna commanded, raising her sword to signal the troops below. The battle commenced with the methodical precision of a deadly dance. Ragna's archers, positioned on the northern slope, began their systematic harassment of Magnus's formations. Their arrows found gaps in armor and shields, creating casualties that forced the enemy to constantly adjust their positions. Ulfrik led the first major assault, his hammer-wielding northern warriors charging down the valley toward Magnus's left flank. The sight of their new king personally leading the attack sent a surge of inspiration through their own forces and visible concern through the enemy ranks. The clash, when it came, was brutal and immediate. Steel rang against steel, shields splintered under axe blows, and men cried out in pain or triumph as the tide of battle shifted moment by moment. Ulfric's hammerwork was devastating. Each swing cleared space around him, creating opportunities for his warriors to exploit. But Earl Aldwin's cavalry responded quickly, wheeling around to strike at the exposed flank of Ulfric's advance. The tactical move was expertly executed, threatening to turn their success into disaster, as heavy horsemen crashed into their formation. "Now," Ragna whispered, then raised her voice to carry across the battlefield. "Signal the Eastern Reserve!" Hidden forces that had been positioned before dawn now revealed themselves, emerging from concealed positions to strike at Aldwin's cavalry from behind. The maneuver had been risky. If discovered too early, it would have failed completely. But the timing was perfect, catching the enemy horses in an impossible position between two forces. The cavalry charge collapsed into chaos as riders found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Some wheeled to face the new threat, others tried to continue their original assault. And the confusion created exactly the kind of opening that experienced warriors knew how to exploit. Ulfrik's northern fighters pressed their advantage ruthlessly, their axes and swords finding targets among the disorganized horsemen. Within minutes, Earl Aldwin's cavalry was in full retreat, leaving their infantry exposed and demoralized. But Magnus was no fool, and he had not achieved his position by being easily outmaneuvered. Even as his eastern flank collapsed, he was already adjusting his strategy, pulling forces from his center to reinforce his western approach, while committing his reserves to a direct assault on Ragna's command position. "He means to end this quickly," Captain Tormund observed, watching the enemy movement with professional interest. "Then we accommodate him," Ragna replied, spurring her horse forward. "All reserves advance. We finish this now." The final phase of the battle became a direct confrontation between the two centers of power. Magnus leading his household guards in a desperate assault on the ridge where Ragna commanded, while she led her own elite troops down to meet them in the valley below. The personal combat that followed would be remembered in songs for generations. Gwyn and Earl, former allies turned mortal enemies, met with sword and shield while their kingdom's futures hung in the balance. Magnus was skilled, experienced, and fighting for everything he believed in. But Ragna carried not just her own strength, but the hopes of everyone who had chosen to follow her vision of a different kind of rule. Their duel raged across the battlefield as the larger conflict swirled around them. Steel sparked against steel, shields took bone-jarring impacts, and both warriors pushed themselves beyond normal human limits in pursuit of victory that would determine the fate of a kingdom. It was Ulfrik who ended it, his warhammer crushing the helmet of Earl Garrett as the western flank finally collapsed. With two of their three commanders dead or fled, Magnus's army began to disintegrate despite their earl's personal courage. "Yield," Ragna called out, her sword at Magnus's throat as he knelt bleeding in the valley mud. "Your cause is lost." Magnus looked up at her with eyes full of hatred and defeat, but also a grudging recognition of her victory. "You have won this battle," he said through gritted teeth. "But the foreign army still comes. You may have destroyed me, but you have not saved your kingdom. Watch me," Ragna replied, and something in her voice made even her enemy believe that perhaps, against all odds, she might actually succeed. "No regrets," she said simply. "Win or lose, we do this together." The enemy army was impressive in its organization and size. Earl Magnus had positioned his forces well, using the natural terrain to maximize his defensive advantages. His cavalry held the high ground on the eastern ridge. His infantry formed solid squares in the center, and his archers commanded the approaches from elevated positions. But Ragna's forces brought advantages of their own. The northern warriors who had marched south for her were veterans of countless border skirmishes, hardened fighters who excelled at the kind of fluid, aggressive tactics that could break traditional formations. Ulfrik's workers had proven surprisingly effective as support troops, their experience with tools and coordination translating well to siege equipment and logistics. "Signal from the scouts," reported Captain Tormund, galloping up to their position on the ridge overlooking the battlefield. "Magnus has divided his command. He leads the center personally, but Earl Aldwin commands the eastern flank, and Earl Garrett holds the western approach." It was valuable intelligence, confirming what they had suspected about internal tensions among the rebel earls. A divided command meant opportunities for exploitation, but it also meant they faced multiple tactical minds rather than a single coordinated strategy. "And the foreign army?" Ragna asked. "Still 2 days' march to the west, but our scouts report they have increased their pace. King Thormund drives his men hard. He wants to arrive while we are still weakened from this battle." The time pressure was enormous. They needed to defeat Magnus decisively and quickly, then turn to face a foreign invasion while their own forces were bloodied and exhausted from civil war. "Begin the advance," Ragna commanded, raising her sword to signal the troops below. The battle commenced with the methodical precision of a deadly dance. Ragna's archers, positioned on the northern slope, began their systematic harassment of Magnus's formations. Their arrows found gaps in armor and shields, creating casualties that forced the enemy to constantly adjust their positions. Ulfrik led the first major assault, his hammer-wielding northern warriors charging down the valley toward Magnus's left flank. The sight of their new king personally leading the attack sent a surge of inspiration through their own forces and visible concern through the enemy ranks. The clash, when it came, was brutal and immediate. Steel rang against steel, shields splintered under axe blows, and men cried out in pain or triumph as the tide of battle shifted moment by moment. Ulfrik's hammerwork was devastating. Each swing cleared space around him, creating opportunities for his warriors to exploit, but Earl Aldwin's cavalry responded quickly, wheeling around to strike at the exposed flank of Ulfrik's advance. The tactical move was expertly executed, threatening to turn their success into disaster as heavy horsemen crashed into their formation. "Now," Ragna whispered, then raised her voice to carry across the battlefield. "Signal the Eastern Reserve." Hidden forces that had been positioned before dawn now revealed themselves, emerging from concealed positions to strike at Aldwin's cavalry from behind. The maneuver had been risky. If discovered too early, it would have failed completely. But the timing was perfect, catching the enemy horses in an impossible position between two forces. The cavalry charge collapsed into chaos as riders found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Some wheeled to face the new threat, others tried to continue their original assault. And the confusion created exactly the kind of opening that experienced warriors knew how to exploit. Ulfrik's northern fighters pressed their advantage ruthlessly, their axes and swords finding targets among the disorganized horsemen. Within minutes, Earl Aldwin's cavalry was in full retreat, leaving their infantry exposed and demoralized. But Magnus was no fool, and he had not achieved his position by being easily outmaneuvered. Even as his eastern flank collapsed, he was already adjusting his strategy, pulling forces from his center to reinforce his western approach while committing his reserves to a direct assault on Ragna's command position. "He means to end this quickly," Captain Tormund observed, watching the enemy movement with professional interest. "Then we accommodate him," Ragna replied, spurring her horse forward. "All reserves advance. We finish this now." The final phase of the battle became a direct confrontation between the two centers of power. Magnus leading his household guards in a desperate assault on the ridge where Ragna commanded, while she led her own elite troops down to meet them in the valley below. The personal combat that followed would be remembered in songs for generations. Queen and Earl, former allies turned mortal enemies, met with sword and shield while their kingdom's futures hung in the balance. Magnus was skilled, experienced, and fighting for everything he believed in. But Ragna carried not just her own strength, but the hopes of everyone who had chosen to follow her vision of a different kind of rule. Their duel raged across the battlefield as the larger conflict swirled around them. Steel sparked against steel, shields took bone-jarring impacts, and both warriors pushed themselves beyond normal human limits in pursuit of victory that would determine the fate of a kingdom. It was Ulfrik who ended it, his warhammer crushing the helmet of Earl Garrett as the western flank finally collapsed. With two of their three commanders dead or fled, Magnus's army began to disintegrate despite their earl's personal courage. "Yield," Ragna called out, her sword at Magnus's throat as he knelt bleeding in the valley mud. "Your cause is lost." Magnus looked up at her with eyes full of hatred and defeat, but also a grudging recognition of her victory. "You have won this battle," he said through gritted teeth. "But the foreign army still comes. You may have destroyed me, but you have not saved your kingdom. Watch me," Ragna replied, and something in her voice made even her enemy believe that perhaps, against all odds, she might actually succeed. 3 months after the Battle of Thornfield, Queen Ragna and King Consort Ulfrik stood once again in the Great Hall where their journey had begun. But the space had been transformed, much like the kingdom itself. The forge still dominated the eastern wall, but now it was flanked by council tables where nobles, merchants, and craftsmen met as equals to discuss the realm's business. The foreign invasion had never materialized. King Thormund's army had turned back when word reached them of Magnus's decisive defeat and the unified kingdom that awaited them. Without internal allies and facing a population united behind their victorious queen, even 20,000 soldiers had seemed insufficient for conquest. Earl Magnus himself had been granted exile rather than execution, a mercy that had surprised many, but demonstrated the kind of ruler Ragna intended to be. His lands had been redistributed among those who had proven their loyalty, while his surviving followers were offered the chance to earn forgiveness through service to the crown. "The northern territories report the best harvest in a generation," Ulfrik said, reviewing the reports that had arrived with the morning riders. "The new trade agreements you negotiated with Jarl Eriksson have opened markets we never imagined." Ragna smiled, watching as representatives from across the kingdom conducted their business in the hall. A farmer from the southern regions discussed crop rotation with a northern clan chief. A merchant negotiated shipping contracts with a guildmaster. A young noble learned metalwork techniques from one of Ulfrik's former apprentices. "Father would never have recognized this," she said softly. "A throne room where the queen's subjects actually talked to each other instead of just to the crown. Do you think he would have approved?" It was a question that had haunted her through the difficult months of rebuilding. Her father had been a good king by traditional standards, strong, decisive, protective of his realm, but he had ruled through separation, maintaining order by keeping different groups focused on their individual roles rather than their common interests. "I think he would have understood the necessity," she said finally. "He taught me that a ruler's first duty is to preserve the kingdom. How we do that must change with the times." Lady Maren approached with a bundle of correspondence from foreign courts. The victory at Thornfield had not gone unnoticed by neighboring kingdoms, and the marriage alliance between queen and commoner had sparked interest and some concern among traditional monarchies. "King Harold of Eastmarch requests a meeting to discuss trade relationships," Maren reported. "King Frederick of the Northern Isles has sent congratulations on your marriage and hints at his own troubles with rebellious nobles and the southern kingdoms." Ragna asked, cautious but respectful. "Your victory demonstrated that new approaches to governance can be successful. Several courts are quietly inquiring about our methods." The irony was not lost on Ragna. The marriage that her own earls had seen as a sign of weakness was now viewed by foreign powers as evidence of innovative strength. The kingdom that had nearly torn itself apart over questions of tradition versus change was becoming a model for others facing similar challenges. Ulfrik set aside his reports and moved to stand beside her at the great window that overlooked the courtyard below. The scene there would have been impossible just months before. Children from noble and common families playing together while their parents conducted business. Guards sharing meals with craftsmen. The easy interaction of people who had learned to see each other as fellow citizens rather than members of separate castes. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, echoing the question from their wedding morning. "About which part?" "Any of it. The ultimatum, the war, marrying a blacksmith instead of a king." Ragna considered the question seriously. The path they had chosen had been dangerous, costly in lives and resources, and had required them to gamble everything on an uncertain outcome. A more cautious ruler might have found safer solutions. "I regret the necessity of war," she said finally. "I regret every life lost, because Magnus chose rebellion over negotiation. But the rest of it?" She turned to face him fully, this man who had become her partner in both rule and life. "No regrets." Father Benedict approached with news that brought smiles to both their faces. "Your Majesties, I bring word from the Eastern Territories. The new mining operations have struck a substantial silver vein. The engineers estimate it will provide significant revenue for the royal treasury." The silver mine was one of Ulfrik's projects, an investment in exploration that his experience as a metalworker had suggested might prove valuable. Traditional nobles would never have undertaken such speculative ventures, preferring the established income from agricultural taxes. And the workers? Ulfrik asked. Paid fair wages, housed in proper quarters and grateful for the opportunity, Benedict replied. The local priest tells me they speak of their king and queen with genuine affection. It was the kind of success that validated their entire approach, prosperity built through innovation and fair dealing, rather than extraction and exploitation. The kingdom was becoming wealthier, not by taking more from its people, but by creating new opportunities for them to prosper. As evening approached, the formal business of the day concluded and the great hall began to empty. Soon, only Ragna and Ulfrik remained, standing together in the space where they had first confronted the choice that had transformed their lives and their kingdom. Do you remember what you told me by the river all those years ago? Ragna asked, taking his hand in hers. Which part? You said that the best relationships were built by two people working toward the same goals, supporting each other's strengths and covering for each other's weaknesses. I was young and probably too philosophical for my own good. You were wise beyond your years. She squeezed his hand gently. We have built something here together, something that neither of us could have achieved alone. Outside the great windows, the kingdom stretched away under a canopy of stars. In villages and towns across the realm, people slept peacefully in their beds, secure in the knowledge that their rulers understood the value of both strength and mercy. Tradition and innovation, love and duty, the iron crown still rested on Ragna's head, as it would until the day she died. But its weight no longer felt like a burden. Shared with the right partner, even the heaviest responsibilities could become bearable. Tomorrow brings new challenges, Ulfrik said softly. Tomorrow brings new possibilities, she corrected. And in her voice was the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned that sometimes the most dangerous choices led to the most worthwhile destinations. In the great hall, where a queen had once demanded impossible things from the man she loved, two rulers now stood together, looking toward a future they would build side by side. Some stories end with kingdoms saved. The best ones end with kingdoms transformed.